All right, so now that we've got that those introductions over, let's get into the presentation.
So today's focus will be talking about decolonization and indigenization and finding our way along the path together. The first task is to kind of define decolonization. This can be difficult because there are many contexts, understandings, and viewpoints around what it can and should mean, or what it does and doesn't mean. So understanding decolonization, I think, really means coming down to understanding what colonization itself is and our place within that process. So if we try to understand, or at least have a sense of what colonization is, then I think we can begin to view decolonization as the undoing or unlearning of the colonial mindset. And then we can create space for Indigenous ways of knowing, including social, political, spiritual, and cultural contexts and worldviews to emerge. So embarking on this journey really requires reimagining what teaching and learning is and what life is and our place within all of it, not with the goal of reaching a destination, but through thoughtfully and continually looking inward and also outward to find our way along this path.
So to understand what decolonization is, we should try to understand what colonization is. According to some scholars, the colonization occurs with 4 steps. So the first one would be the serious modification of Indigenous ways of life, including political, economical, social, and spiritual systems. Next, there's a setting up of external political control. Next, there is forcing the Indigenous population to become economically dependent on the colonizer. And then we end up with the last phase, which is providing poor quality social services such as education, healthcare for the Indigenous population. Another way to define it would be colonization is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the Indigenous peoples of an area, the action of appropriating a place of domain for one's own use. So knowing this, let's take just a moment to reflect on, what does that mean? What does that mean today, right? We understand that, most of us understand that this was a violent process that has occurred in the past. But really, let's start thinking about how that has led to what we do today, and how does this continue, and how is this ongoing today?
I think many people in Canada believe that colonization is something of the past, and it still conjures up these images of ships filled with spices, explorers looking for a new world, and the direct rule of colonies under a royal house, like that of the British Empire. However, for most Indigenous peoples within Canada, colonialism is not a legacy from long ago, but rather a lived reality, and continues on carrying with it the traumas of the past, yet also perpetuating new ones into the present. So in thinking about those images of ships, I wanted to kind of bring our minds to imagining new ships. What are some new ships that we can begin to sail together? So relationships, partnerships, mentorship, and allyship, I think, are all key parts of how we can come together to think about decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation as well. So thinking about those 4 new ships and what we can bring to those, and how we can move those things forward to create opportunities to share and learn together.
So if we're thinking back from the colonization aspect and using the land for our own purposes, how can we shift those purposes that we're using today on this land for building those ships that Lindsay just mentioned? So decolonization at Queen's, this are a few ideas of how that can look like. Building capacity in strategic areas to support Indigenous programming, recognizing and supporting Indigenous scholarship and traditional knowledge, making some room for that at the table, integrating Indigenous knowledges into curricula. So in the programs that we're offering, in the courses that we're offering, developing training and guidelines for Indigenous research and work with Indigenous communities. So a lot of people don't know how to engage with Indigenous communities and how to bring those voices in. So getting some training and guidelines to work on that and help expand that. Continuing to build the capacity of the Office of Indigenous Initiatives and other meaningful inclusion of Indigenous voices in policy and decision-making at senior administration levels. And that's just not just at those levels. Those are very important, but also if you're not in that type of position, providing a seat at the table for any type of indigenization voices in whatever that you're doing in your department. So there was recently some discussions in my department about, possibly including land acknowledgements on websites. Having an Indigenous voice at those discussions, having a seat at that table when Indigenous policies are being discussed is very important. And it's something that can be overlooked when people that are at those levels, like faculty and department meetings, might overlook that and think, oh, well, we're discussing our policies, but is there an Indigenous voice in that room? Is there an Indigenous person there to help advocate for what the community needs? Something to keep in mind. And those are just a few examples. There's so much more. So decolonization at Queen's also means continuous engagement and integration of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to actions, and Queen's own report that you can find here. There's a link there, and if you Google it, you'll be able to find it too. Just good places to look, and there's also some videos that we have on the CTL website that go into detail on this.
Now turning to indigenization, really thinking about what that can mean. So I think if we think about decolonization as the unsettling or undoing of the colonial power and structures and ways of learning and teaching, then indigenization can be understood as the redoing or reaffirming of education to include Indigenous ways of knowing, thinking, feeling, believing, and being. This work really involves elevating the voices of Indigenous peoples, meaningful inclusion of traditional and cultural knowledge, and intentional inclusion of Indigenous ways of knowing and teaching to form and create pedagogical approaches. So really looking at ways that we can challenge existing structures, ways that we can weave in Indigenous ways of knowing and worldviews into content in courses, for example, and also in the way that we teach and engage with our students.
So this work can be done by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. For non-Indigenous people to take on this work, it requires respectful relationship building, ongoing consultation, and partnership with Indigenous peoples. It requires a willingness to continually engage in unlearning, unpacking of biases, examining power and privilege, and constantly learning from and with Indigenous peoples about their ways of knowing with their lived experiences. So we often think about traditional knowledge and understanding ways of being and ways of knowing, and we sometimes view that as all being in the past, right? So I think it's important here to highlight learning from and with, because both communities, both societies are moving through time, right? And we are evolving and we're learning new things, and hopefully we would like to learn new things together as opposed to separately.
There's a great article as well by Garvie and Lorenz from 2018 that really breaks down the types of indigenization. So the first type that they mention and define is Indigenous inclusion. So Indigenous inclusion is really a policy that aims to increase the number of Indigenous students, faculty, and staff in the Canadian Academy. And it does so largely by supporting the adaptation of Indigenous people to the current, often alienating culture of the Canadian Academy. So that's one way to kind of increase visibility. A lot of hiring practices will encourage more Indigenous hiring. It could also be admissions policies that work to admit more Indigenous students or attract more Indigenous students. And then the second piece is reconciliation indigenization. And so this is more of a vision that locates indigenization on common ground between Indigenous and Canadian ideals, and really creating new broader consensus on debates such as what constitutes knowledge, and how should Indigenous knowledge and European derived knowledge be reconciled, thinking about what types of relationships academic institutions should have with Indigenous communities, and really looking at meaningful ways to kind of bring the two different worldviews together and to make that representative within academic spaces and settings. And then there's the third one, which is decolonial indigenization. And this is where it envisions the wholesale overhaul of the academy. So this would be fundamentally reorienting knowledge production bases based on looking at rebalancing power relations, transforming the academy into something dynamic and new. So these different stages you can see across Canada, various institutions are working away at different ones. I think it's good to work into all three areas. And I think the first stage is great, but it's not enough to just add in Indigenous employees, add in Indigenous students, and expect them to be able to kind of thrive in this academic environment without creating those other changes as well to spaces and structures and what counts as knowledge and what's kind of tangibly and visibly here for them to experience, and also other non-Indigenous scholars as well to learn from those worldviews is so important. So I think many universities are doing a better job on number one, maybe working pretty heavily into number two and thinking about strategies for inclusion and for indigenization across the board. But this last one is kind of the overall dream one, and I think it'll take a long time to get there, and that there's a lot that needs to happen in the meantime before that can take place. But it's worth a goal worth pursuing, and really thinking about ways that we can reorient and we can change and re-envision things, and the way that we do things within the structures, and looking at what are the best of kind of both worldviews that we can bring forward to create something dynamic and new.
Yeah, so like Lindsay said, that can be a little bit overwhelming, right? We hear so much of what's going on, and most of us know that it's a big history to unpack, and it's very overwhelming. And so sometimes if something is a little bit very overwhelming, we want to resist actually doing it, or we can feel hopeless. Like, what is the point of doing this? Since there's no way we could ever right those wrongs. But the reality is that this is the reality we have, and we should do something. So start small and work from there and do this path together. So, why should I travel this path when the destination seems so out of reach? Decolonization is a goal, but it's not an end point. The struggle for decolonization is a journey that is never finished, and that on this journey, uncertainty is not to be feared. So, when we don't know what, there's a sort of saying that I like, is we can't imagine what we don't know. So although it can be very scary to think about uncertainty, there's also a large amount of possibility in there too, to beautiful futures that we can't even imagine because it's not within our repertoire yet. So I think that's just something that we can maybe hold on to when we take the steps on this journey that might seem very, very long.
I love this image for this particular well chosen. It just reminds you, like, what's underneath the surface. Like, looking at that image makes me think about possibilities and hope as well. So thank you for that, Monica. The next kind of steps, Monica can talk a little bit more further about what are some ideas around encouraging this work.
Yeah, so when focusing on the idea of reaching a complete decolonial state, which is one where all the wrongs of colonization have completely been undone and made right, it can seem impossible because we can't go into the past and change things. We can only move forward into the future. So don't be discouraged. The act of working towards that utopic ideal is a worthwhile endeavor, and we don't know where it'll lead. Like I said, we can have these beautiful futures that we could never imagine because we've never experienced it. It might be on the horizon if we work together on this. The true goals of decolonization are to center and uplift Indigenous voices, to challenge the oppression of Indigenous peoples, to advocate Indigenous rights, sovereignty, and land, to advocate for Indigenous children's access to education, healthcare, and support, to promote and support Indigenous ways of knowing, to protect the land and water, and to combat stereotypes and promote intercultural understanding through education.
So I think we often ask ourselves too, where can I begin, or where should I position myself within this work? I think an important question to ask yourself as you're engaging in this type of work is asking why you want to decolonize. Who are you doing the work for, and what is your rationale for doing it? So we're all implicated in and through colonialism, and how we decolonize is actually directly connected to how we're implicated. So really thinking about that and thinking about your positionality when you come to this work as well is so important. And remembering that this is a journey, there's no endpoint, there's no destination, but rather a constant experience of searching, finding and rediscovering your way along the path. And remembering that you don't have to do this journey alone, that you can find a community of support around, and surround yourself with other like-minded people that are looking to do this work. And you should do this work always in relation with others, and building connections with Indigenous communities or Indigenous peoples to learn from and with them, as well as to how you can take those steps or what steps are important to take, is really crucial to this work as well. So I think finding, like I said, finding your people, finding a community of practice, others that are doing this work, and you can work together to help and guide and support each other, being willing to listen, stepping up and stepping back as needed, learning and unlearning, and experiencing things from a place of humility, respect, care, and love, and really grounding this work in, like I said, finding your why, and really grounding it in that, and also finding others that can support you in it. And because it is so overwhelming, or it can seem so overwhelming, to break it down into measurable pieces or goals for yourself of, here are some short-term things I can do now, here are some things I'd like to do in the future, and then kind of develop a plan for yourself as well. So we do have as well a Pedagogy of Peace that I've created, which is a curriculum framework that really focuses on self and relation, community building, and a focus on using our strengths to kind of improve pedagogy or curriculum work. And also I've created a community of practice around that too. So it's a team space right now, and we mostly post updates on upcoming events that might be of interest. There might be some opportunity for informal discussions, or just a way to connect with others doing this work, and maybe talk about research projects coming up that others might want to be involved with or know about, and just a space to really share. So that's a virtual space right now. And if you're interested in joining that, you can reach out to me and I can add you to that team space. You can also learn more about the Pedagogy of Peace on the CTL website. There's a whole website dedicated to that specifically, and a lovely informational video that our tech student helped me create. So that it's about 7 minutes or so explaining the model, explaining how it can be applied, and some details around it as well. But I really wanted to invite you into that, and also let you know too that at the CTL we're available for consultations if you have questions specific to your courses, ways to indigenize or decolonize your content or your teaching practices. You can always reach out to us in the CTL, myself or Monica, or others on the team as well that can help guide and support that work too.
And that brings us to the end of the presentation. We've got a few references put here, but of course there's just so many references that you can refer to on this topic. Lindsay or I would be happy to share whatever resources you're looking for whatever aspect you're interested, whatever rabbit hole you want to pursue. It's such a large topic, right? So start small, start with something specific, and then work your way from there. We're happy to share whatever resources. So with that, I'll just say, Miigwech Bizindawiag, thank you for listening to us. I hope that you got something useful out of the presentation, and I'm really looking forward to what questions you have and continuing this discussion for the next half hour through questions and answers. Miigwech.
Great, and I'll just echo that. Nyalagoa, thanks so much for your attention, and I'll stop sharing the slides and we can stop the recording.